Alright guys, listen up please. The warm-up is going to be questions similar to what you'll see on your CBA. We have not really taken a formal, full-fledged CBA this whole year, mainly due to Harvey. But your semester exam is going to be your CBA. Now what scares me about that is I don't get to see it till the day I give it. So I was looking at old CBAs, and lots of times they use the same type of questions. And these three problems were on last year's semester CBA. Oh, now we have done this. It's been a while since we did a binomial times a trinomial. And number 3, they always find a kind of a trickier way or a different way to test to see if you know how to do things. So I want to make sure for the next 2 weeks that you are really, really paying attention to your warm-ups, guys. This isn't just blow-off questions. These are important questions. We are going to talk about your Miss Heim test, the factoring test. And you will take another part to that this week. The first part was just factoring. The second part is going to be actually solving. Okay, so I was going to give it on Friday, but the music tour is Friday, and I'm going to have a bunch of kids out. So it'll probably be Thursday. So keep that in mind as well. We got a lot of stuff coming up in the next few weeks. It's going to be jam-packed. All right, number 1. It's kind of like the FOIL method. Oh, thank you. It's on freeze. It's kind of like the FOIL method. 3x has to multiply by everything over here. And please pay attention to your exponents. What's 3x times 9x squared? Good. 27x to the third. What's 3x times negative 6x? Negative 18x squared. And then 3x times 4 is positive 12x. Alright, then you grab the 2 and you multiply it times everything. 2 times 9x squared is positive 18x squared. 2 times negative 6x is negative 12x. And positive 2 times positive 4 is positive 8. Then you look for chances to simplify by adding or combining like terms if there are any. I don't see any other x to the thirds besides this one, so 27x to the third stays the same. Something kind of weird happened on this problem. Negative 18x squared, positive 18x squared. Cancel out. Positive 12x, negative 12x. They cancel out. And then I had a plus 8. Alright, number 2. Dividing. And again, if you don't like it written like this, you can write it with a fraction bar if that makes you more comfortable. What are we used to doing to a problem that looks like this? Factoring. Guess what one of the factors is going to be? It's probably going to be 3x minus 2. And in fact, I do think that works. 3x minus 2 and x plus 4. That would give me 3x squared. That would give me a positive 12x. And a negative 2x, which gives me a positive 10x in the middle, and I do get negative 8 on the end. So I factored that. Now I'm dividing by 3x minus 2, and that entire factor will cancel out. And the answer here is just x plus 4. Alright, now number 3. I still have kids who think they can do that in their head, and you really can't. How do you multiply a binomial times itself? The two thingies, yes. You got to write it out side by side, and you've got to use that FOIL method. You can't really do it in your head. What's x times x? X squared. What's x times negative y? Negative xy or negative yx. I just usually put it in alphabetical order. Negative xy. Now look what's going to happen here. I have a negative y times a positive x. That's another negative xy. And then negative y times negative y is positive y squared. And these two terms in the middle are exactly alike. I've got a negative xy and another negative xy. They don't cancel out. Negative 2xy. So final answer here is x squared minus 2xy plus y squared. So it's more complicated than it looked. If you are trying to square a binomial, you cannot do that in your head. Alright, so that's a little bit of review for your CBA. We took a test Friday. We're going to go over that in a minute. I want to get the lesson out of the way. Please, please, please do not freak out when you see this quadratic formula. I don't know. I can't tell if it was easy or not. First period, sometimes they're zombies. Sometimes they won't be quiet. Today they were zombies. So I couldn't really tell what they thought of this lesson. Let's see what you guys think of it. Here's the quadratic formula. Opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2 times a. Yeah, see, they didn't say a thing. They just sat there. Now, it's a plus and a minus. Yes, this is like two formulas written together. You're going to get two separate answers. In other words, one of the formulas is this. One of the formulas you're going to add, but one of the formulas you're going to subtract. And instead of having to write two separate formulas, they just write it all as one. And at the very end, we break it apart into two separate answers. Okay. Before we start diving into the wonderful, lovely, fun-to-use quadratic formula, I want you to understand what it's used for. This is another way to find roots of a quadratic function, of a parabola, of a quadratic formula. What's another word for roots? Zeros. What's another word for zeros and roots? X-intercepts. Exactly. So this is just yet another way for us to figure out where a parabola or a quadratic function is going to cross the x-axis. We're looking for those two important, well, there's not always two, but today there are going to be 2 points where it crosses the x-axis. Those are the zeros, the roots. The solutions when the function equals 0. Now, good question. Can we just use calculators? There are many methods to finding the zeros or the roots or the x-intercepts. One way is by solving an equation by factoring. Another way is the calculator. And yes, I will teach you how to use the calculator to find the roots for you. Most people like that way the best. Another way is the quadratic formula. And yet another way is something called completing the square. And you have to know how to use all of them. Sometimes they will write a question that forces you to set it up like quadratic formula. So even though this isn't the best way to solve it always, certainly not the easiest way to solve it always, it's a way you have to know how to do. And today we're going to start with easy questions. The way when quadratic formula is helpful is when it's a really weird decimal or fraction where the parabola is crossing the x-axis. When it's not a nice whole number or a nice decimal that terminates like 1.5 or something like that, that's when the quadratic formula is useful. Plus, you just got to know how to do it, whether you like it or not. And the more you do it, the easier it gets, I promise. The more you do it, the easier it gets. Now, all we're going to do is plug in numbers here and simplify it. You got to be very careful. The most mistakes I find are made inside the radical symbol, especially on this back end right here. You got to watch your signs. Okay, that's where most mistakes are made. What? Yes, I think it will be on the CBA. Okay, now, where do we get these numbers? Where do we get A, B, and C? Because we need to replace A, B, and C with numbers. Well, this is where we get them. We get them from the format of the quadratic equation. A quadratic equation, if it's in standard form, should look like this. ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So a is always the number in front of the x squared term. Because all these are just numbers. We're going to replace them with numbers. B is the number in front of x. It doesn't include the x. It's the number in front of x. And C is the constant at the end. So this is just yet one more way to find roots or solutions or zeros or x-intercepts to a quadratic function. Is it the easiest way? Probably not. But you still got to know how to do it. Some kids, if you absolutely hated factoring, then this is for you. Alright, now we're going to start with a nice easy one. How do I know I'm supposed to solve this and not just factor it? It equals 0. Your homework will be questions like this. I do not want to see you factoring. I want to see you quadratic formulaing. Okay, so I need to see all that work. You're not going to get credit unless you show me the work. Now, could we solve this by factoring? Absolutely. Would it be much easier? Absolutely. So let's just factor it just so we can see what we're supposed to get as our answers. This one's really easy to factor. What are the factors of 4 that add up to -5? X minus 4 times x minus 1. Now those are factors, because one way to find zeros is by factoring, which would lead you to the solutions. So if x minus 4 equaled 0, then x would equal 4. If x minus 1 equals 0, then x would equal 1. So just keep that in mind. This parabola is crossing the x-axis at 1 and 4. It's doing something like this. So our answers should end up being 1 and 4, no matter if we did it in the calculator, no matter if we did it by factoring, and no matter if we did it with this lovely, fun quadratic formula that we're about to use. And I want to see on your homework, the only reason why you should factor on your homework is if you're checking your answer. Otherwise, I got to see where you use this fun formula. Okay, so let's start. Now, first step is to make sure your equation's in standard form so you can correctly identify what A, B, and C are. So then we can plug them in and work it out. A is always the number in front of x squared. What's the number in front of x squared here? 1, an invisible 1. B is always the number in front of x. What's B? C is always the constant at the end with no variable. What's C? Okay, so we're going to plug those lovelies into this formula. First step is to just replace the letters. The only part that I do in my head is I always do b squared in my head. Okay, so for example, the first thing I write down is the opposite of b. I do that part in my head too. If b is -5, what's the opposite of b? +5. So that part I did in my head. Whatever b is, I change its sign. I change its sign. Plus or minus the square root of. Now I'm about to do b squared, and let me just tell you, any number squared is positive. A negative times a negative is positive. A positive times a positive is positive. So I know whatever I put right here is always going to be a positive amount. What is -5 squared? +25. So these two parts I kind of do in my head. The rest of it I just completely write out what A, B, and C are. So then I'm going to put a minus sign, because it's always a minus sign. There's always a 4 there. And then it's times A times C, all divided by 2 times A. And in this case, A is a 1. Okay, so are you okay with that first step? All I did was plug in every letter, and I did the opposite of B in my head, and I did b squared in my head. And then I just plugged in every other value for the letters. Now, you want to work inside the radical symbol first. You got to get the radical symbol simplified. Let me just tell you, for today's purposes only, we're starting off kind of easy. You should get a nice, positive, perfect square inside your radical symbol. And if you don't, somewhere along the line you messed up. Okay, this is what I do next. I determine the sign of this cluster right here. -4 times 1 times 4. How many negatives are in there? 1 negative. That means that's going to be a negative cluster. So keep that in mind. I always determine the sign first. And then I can just do the multiplying and not worry about the sign. I know it's going to be a 25, and I know it's going to be a negative cluster. What's 4 times 1 times 4? Yeah, it's going to be a -16. -4 times 1 times 4 is -16. Alright, so what is 25 minus 16? 9. So now I have 5 plus or minus the square root of 9, all divided by 2. So for today's purposes, just on today's, they're going to be rigged for you. You should get a nice positive perfect square inside the radical symbol. And if you don't, something went wrong. Is 9 a perfect square? Now I'm ready to actually do the square rooting. What is the square root of 9? 3. So that square root symbol is going to disappear now. because I'm going to take the square root of 9. And now I'm almost done. So now I have 5 plus or minus 3 all divided by 2. Here's where I get two answers. I've got to do 5 plus 3 divided by 2, and I've got to do 5 minus 3 divided by 2. Well, what's 5 plus 3? And what's 8 divided by 2? 4. What's 5 minus 3? 2. And what's 2 divided by 2? So my two roots are 4 and 1. Isn't that what we got when we factored a second ago? You have to know how to use the quadratic formula. But I promise you, the more you do this, the faster you're going to get at it. It's not going to seem so bad. All right, you better be focused. Zoe, are you with me? Number 2, let's try this one. 2x squared minus 6x minus 20 equals 0. Yes, we could factor this, and it would probably be much easier than using the quadratic formula. I'm telling you, you have to know how to set up the quadratic formula. If nothing else, you're going to be tested on it. All right, what's A here? 2, not 2x squared, just 2. Not 2x, it's just 2. B is negative 6. And what's C? Negative 20. Here's my formula. Opposite of B, plus or minus, square root of B squared minus 4AC, all divided by 2A. The formula will be given to you. You don't have to memorize the formula. Y'all have got to be trying this. If you're not trying, you're never going to get it. All right, what's the opposite of B? 6. B is negative 6, so the opposite of negative 6 would be positive 6. You always take the opposite of B. And inside the radical symbol, you're going to do B squared. Well, I do that in my head as well. Negative 6 squared is positive 36. Minus 4 times 2 times negative 20. All divided by 2 times A, which in this case is 2 times 2. So just take a second to let that sink in. That's in the first step. I do two things. I did the opposite of B in my head, I did B squared in my head, and then otherwise, all I did was plug in the values of A, B, and C. I always kind of leave a little space under my radical symbol because I like to simplify inside the radical symbol. And the first thing I do is look at the cluster of 3 things getting multiplied. This is a negative 4 times a positive 2 times a negative 20. What is that cluster going to come out to be? Positive. So now I know this is 36 plus, and then I know it's going to be a positive cluster because I've got 2 negative numbers. 2 negatives make a positive when you're multiplying. Then I can just do the multiplying in my head. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 20 is 160. Okay, so now I'm ready to rewrite this. I'm going to do 36 plus 160, which is 196. So now I have 6 plus or minus the square root of 196, all divided by 4. Now, 196 might not be one of the perfect squares that you're familiar with. I strongly suggest you make yourselves familiar with the first 15 perfect squares. A while back, we put a list in our notes. Does anybody remember what the square root of 1? It's 14. Okay, so now I can write this. I'm going to take the square root of 196, which means the radical sign is finally going to disappear. So now this becomes 6 plus or minus 14 divided by 4, and we're almost done now. I'm going to erase my first step so I can make some space here. You're going to do 6 plus 14 divided by 4, and you're going to do 6 minus 14 divided by 4. So what is 6 plus 14? So 20 divided by 4 is 5. So one of my roots is 5. Over here, 6 minus 14 is negative 8. And negative 8 divided by 4? is negative 2. So this parabola is going to cross at negative 2 and positive 5. There's my zeros, my roots, my x-intercepts. It's going to do something like this. Is it the only way to find roots? Absolutely not, but it's the way we're learning today. All right, number 3. 2x squared plus 7x plus 6 equals 0. Again, for today's purposes only, because these are rigged for you to work out nice and whole numbery. Well, actually, they're not all going to be whole numbers. But inside the radical symbol, you should get a nice perfect square. What's A? 2. What's B? 7. What's C? 6. Do you want to try this one on your own? All right, you go. Opposite of B, plus or minus square root of B squared minus 4AC, all divided by 2A. You're going to need to have this formula handy for your homework tonight. You must show me where you use this. Guys, I'm telling you, if you factor on your homework tonight, you're not going to get credit. Yes, the very first thing you do is take the opposite of B. The opposite of B is going to be negative 7 here. No. Plus or minus the square root of B squared. What's 7 squared? 49. Minus 4 times 2 times 6, all divided by 2 times A. And in this case, that's a 2. 2 times 2. If you don't want to have to keep writing it over and over, I make a lot of space underneath my radical symbol so I can keep simplifying underneath the radical sign. Again, make sure, and this doesn't always happen, but today it should happen. You should get a nice, perfect square inside your radical symbol for today's homework because they're rigged for you to do that. What did you get inside the radical symbol? You should get a 1, which is a perfect square. Because this becomes 49. This is going to be a negative cluster here. Minus 48. And 49 minus 48 is 1. And what's the square root of 1? 1. So I have negative 7 plus or minus 1 divided by 4. So the more you do it, the easier this should become. It's not as bad as it looked at first. Then I do this. I don't write it out as 2 separate problems. I kind of do it in my head. What's negative 7 plus 1? So one of them is negative 6 over 4, which I'm going to reduce in a minute. What's negative 7 minus 1? Negative 8 over 4. So for one of them, I get a nice whole number, negative 2. Negative 6 over 4, I just need to reduce that. What does that reduce to? Negative 3 over 2. So this is what's happening on this parabola. It's crossing at negative 2. And it's also crossing at negative 1.5. So look how close these zeros are. This is a skinny parabola. It's not crossing at 2 nice whole numbers, but it's a nice easy decimal. Negative 1.5 and negative 2. Okay, not so bad? Alright, you try these 2 problems, and then we're going to look at 2 kind of weird scenarios, and then you'll be done with this lesson. 2x squared minus 3x minus 14 equals 0. And number 5, 4x squared minus x minus 5 equals 0. I'm going to pause the recording. You guys work on these. Alright, let's see how you did on these two. You're still on number 4? Alright, I'll start doing number 4 while you're finishing it up, and we'll see if we get the same thing. Alright, on number 4, did y'all get 121 inside the radical symbol? Which again is a nice perfect square. The square root of 121 is 11. So I ended up with 3 plus or minus 11 divided by 4. Well, that's going to give me 14 divided by 4 and negative 8 divided by 4. 3 minus 11 is negative 8. So I get 2 answers. One of them is negative 4 and one of them is 3.5 or 7 over 2. Those were my 2 roots for number 4. Questions on number 4? How did I get 11? Okay, so let's look inside the radical symbol. Let me just focus on inside the radical symbol. Inside the radical symbol is b squared. Well, b is negative 3, and negative 3 squared is positive 9. Minus 4 times a times c, so that would be minus 4 times 2 times negative 14. Now, the 9 is going to get added to all of this junk because a negative 4 times a 2 times a negative 14, that's 2 negatives, and 2 negatives make a giant positive. 4 times 2 is 8. And 14 times 8 is 112. So it turned into 9 plus 112. And 112 plus 9 is 121. So inside the radical symbol is 121. Again, yeah, that turns into a giant positive. And the square root of 121 is 11. So that's why, just to help you get used to this formula, if you don't get a nice perfect square here, you did something wrong. And 121 is a perfect square, and it's 11. All right, let's look at number 5. Number 5, opposite of b would be, well, first of all, a is 4, b is negative 1, and c is negative 5. So opposite of b would be positive 1, right? Plus or minus the square root of b squared. Well, negative 1 squared is positive 1 minus 4 times negative 5, all divided by 2 times a, or in this case 2 times 4. Again, look out for your signs. Look at the cluster at the end inside this radical symbol. What is negative 4 times negative 5 going to become? A giant positive 80. That becomes a giant positive. You got to watch out for the signs, because if you put a negative, it's going to mess you up. And 1 plus 80 is 81. Again, you should get a nice perfect square in here, and if you don't, you did something wrong. So I ended up with 1 plus or minus the square root of 81 divided by 8. And the square root of 81 is a nice whole number of what? 9. So it's 1 plus or minus 9 over 8. 1 plus 9 is 10 divided by 8. 1 minus 9 is negative 8 divided by 8. So I get one whole number answer, one fraction answer. What's negative 8 divided by 8? Negative 1. And 10 over 8 just reduces to 5 over 4, 1 1/4. Alright, so this is your homework. Most of your questions will be like that. Let's look at 2 strange scenarios. Look at number 6 with me, please. 5x squared minus 10x equals 0. What's weird about this one? There is no c. In other words, what do we have to put in for a c? Not a 1. A 0. Because isn't 5x squared minus 10x plus 0 the same thing? So is it going to change anything if I write a c value of 0 in here? No, I can't put a 1 in there. That makes it completely different. But I can put a 0 in there. So what's A? 5. What's B? -10. What's C? 0. All right, fill in everything in C and simplify it as much as you can. It actually kind of makes your life easier, doesn't it? Anything times 0 is 0. Well, it's 100 minus 0. All of this just turns into a giant 0. Well, what's 100 minus 0? 100. And what's the square root of 100? 10. So you end up with 10 plus or minus 10 divided by 10. Lots of 10s here. What is 10 plus 10? So 20 divided by 10 gives us 2 as an answer. 20 divided by 2. 10 plus 10 is 20. Divided by 2. 20 divided by 2 is not 2. Why did I write 2? 20 divided by 2 is 10. What's the other answer? 10 minus 10 is 0. What's 0 divided by anything? 0. Oh, I did have it right. I wrote the wrong thing over here. 20 divided by 10, which is 2. Thank you. Yeah, I wrote a 2 here accidentally, but I meant to write a 10. Yes, that was a mistake. Just making sure you're paying attention. Thank you, Kenny. Kenny was paying attention. Okay, one more weird problem. Number 7. Last weird problem, and then you can start your homework. Then we'll go over the test, actually. We're going to go over the test, yes. All right, what's missing here? The B is missing. Remember, this is difference of two squares. On difference of two squares, the middle term canceled out. So A is 4. What's B here? 0. And what's C? -9. Try this problem, please. It would be much simpler to factor this, I agree, but we're practicing our skills at using the quadratic formula. Four times 9 is 36.
Oh, never mind. Sorry. It's 4 times 8, 36.
Ah, again, making sure you're paying attention. Good job. Okay, did y'all get 144 inside the radical symbol? It turns into 0 plus 144. -4 times 4 times -9. That becomes a giant positive 144. And what's the square root of 144? 12. So you have 0 plus or minus 12 divided by 8. What's 0 plus 12? 12 over 8, which reduced by dividing by 4, and you're going to get 3 over 2. All right, what's 0 minus 12? No. -12. And -12 over 8 is -3 over 2. So we got positive 3 over 2 and -3 over 2. Now, we could have, if I was letting you, we could have just factored this. This factors into 2x plus 3, 2x minus 3, and look how we're going to get the same answers. If 2x plus 3 is 0, you would get negative 3 over 2. Here you would get positive 3 over 2. So do we get the same answers? Absolutely. But today you're practicing quadratic formula. All right, your homework is page 190, 1 through 8, and 12 through 15. You must show me that you are using the quadratic formula, or I will not give you credit. If you want to factor it to check it, you can, but I better see all of your opposite of b, plus or minus, square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. I better see all of that all over the place.